I'm gonna cut to the chase right away and tell you the thing I hate most about this movie. It's that they bleached Chris Hemsworth's eyebrows.
No!
Spoilers ahead for Thor and the rest of the MCU. Okay, so maybe that's not the thing I dislike the most about this film, and as far as criticisms go, that's a very subjective one. But if you think I'm kidding about not liking the bleached eyebrows, they bother me so much, and I don't know why, but after seeing him in the Avengers and beyond with normal eyebrows, he just looks so much better. And if you think I'm the only one who doesn't like them, may I present you with Exhibit A, Kevin Feige, president of Marvel Studios. But let's get into some actual criticisms and my thoughts on the film. So, what do I think about Thor? Well, first of all, it's important to note that this used to actually be my least favorite MCU movie for a long while. I joked that it was only because of the eyebrows, but in all honesty though, there are some things that just don't sit well with me about this film, and I never really knew why. To tell you the truth, as I watched this movie again, I still couldn't really pinpoint what wasn't working well for me, but there definitely was something that just didn't seem to mesh well. The film opens with Jane Foster and her team of Darcy Lewis and Eric Selvig investigating some disturbances in New Mexico. Right away, the film establishes this oddly bland, dark, gloomy color scheme that it employs for almost the entirety of the rest of the film. For some odd reason, there are only a handful of set pieces that have actual color in it. When you're in New Mexico in broad daylight later on in the film, I suppose that's a bit of color, even though the landscape is mostly sand. And then Asgard is pretty colorful, although it's mostly just golden. But outside of those two locations, the film feels just so drab. It has a very similar color scheme, or gradient, or palette, or whatever it may be, to the Incredible Hulk. Jotunheim feels very gloomy, and that may be fine, but then when Thor arrives on Earth, it feels so gloomy, and then when Thor tries to infiltrate the shield base that's surrounding the hammer, it also feels gloomy. And it just makes the film harder to watch because everything feels so unnecessarily sad and heavy. So, with the film opening on Earth, it establishes those Earthbound characters and setting, but it cuts straight to Asgard right after that. It was extremely jarring to transition between the two, however, because as soon as the opening scene ends, we head straight to Asgard for the first third of the film. And while Earth is just normal Earth, Kenneth Branagh decides to make Asgard as Lord of the Rings as he possibly can. He really leans into the Shakespearean aspect of the mythology. I have noticed a common trait between Kenneth Branagh films, actually, because whatever he's doing, he's so unmistakably earnest and takes everything so incredibly seriously, for better or for worse. With the recent Artemis Fowl, it was definitely for worse because that just didn't work at all. The source material was not meant to be taken that seriously in my opinion. But, to his credit, there are some really great elements of fantasy weaved into this film. While Iron Man, Hulk, and Iron Man 2 really rather felt like superhero films, this is the first instance, I think, where this MCU film at least tries to delve into a completely different genre, which is fantasy. When Odin is narrating over the exposition, while, yes, it is exposition, it feels grand, and it's very cool to see the conflicts between the Frost Giants and the Asgardians. That part of it felt very Lord of the Rings, and I thought that was a good thing. However, one thing that I noticed immediately that I cannot forgive Odin for is this. So, it's revealed that he was narrating the entire opening backstory to his two young sons, Thor and Loki, and presents them with this idea that either of them could be king, but only one of them will be. Why would he ever do this? Does he not know his sons well enough to know that by giving one of them false hope that they could be king one day, it would eventually turn them bitter at their brother who would ascend to the throne? The entire Thor-Loki conflict could have been resolved if Odin had just stopped and never gotten Loki's hopes up that he ever had a chance to be king. Because that directly leads into the Avengers, and, well, we know the rest. It's not necessarily the motivation that I have an issue with. I think Loki's ambitions and hurt and jealousy are a really strong arc for the character. I just don't like how much of a mistake Odin made and how easily it could have been avoided. Any rational person should have known that they would sow jealousy in the hearts of one of their sons by telling both of them that they could be king. I mean, maybe Odin really was debating between the two, but he tells Loki later that the plans of making Loki king as a peace offering for the Frost Giants was no longer part of the plan, so it just doesn't make much sense. Let's talk about Loki, though. Loki is, by far and away, and it's not even close, the best part of this movie. And thank goodness they spend a good amount of time with him, because his character arc is so well set up and executed. His jealousy for Thor and hatred for his brother is so well set up, and then when he sees his opportunity to take the throne and use it to please his father, he jumps at that chance. Loki kills Laufey not because he's some sort of righteous good guy, but because he wants his father's approval. And that's a good villain backstory right there. 10,000%. But unfortunately, this movie is not called Loki, so instead we have to follow Thor's character. Now, I'm of two minds here. On one hand, yes, Thor is meant to be oafish, unlikable, arrogant. The whole point of the film is him learning to be humble, and that's fine and all. But I just think that Thor is a little too unlikable. I mean, Tony Stark at the beginning of Iron Man was arrogant, narcissistic, egotistical, but he wasn't necessarily unlikable, and that's why you root for his transformation into the selfless hero later on. Thor just doesn't seem like a guy I'd want to root for. He's brash, he doesn't look out for his friends, and he acts like a 10-year-old boy for most of the film, which just doesn't seem to work for me. And then he gets banished to Earth. So, look, I know that the Earth and the Asgard contrast is sort of the point. I understand that Brana wanted to make a point with the whole fish out of water thing and all, but the contrast between the two settings is so jarring, and they just don't mesh well at all. While the jokes could have been funny, and they should have been funny with Thor asking for another cup of coffee or asking for a horse, they felt almost cringeworthy. They were rather awkward to me. The point is that Thor is supposed to be comically out of his element, and while he is comical, it doesn't necessarily feel like it was the right sort of comedy. It wasn't an earnest sort of thing, it was more of a contrived, forced situation. Carol Danvers and Captain Marvel arriving on Earth felt a little better to me actually, because the jokes of her at the old computer or trying to use a payphone and all that, it just felt more naturally funny. And while I'm not the first to say this, I will join in the many that say that Thor and Jane just don't work. I hope that Taika realizes this for Thor 4 and doesn't really go for that kind of arc again, because I just didn't buy it. I will say that for the most part the action is very solid, and maybe some of my favorites in Phase 1 so far. When Thor goes to Jotunheim, the action is very engaging and it feels very fantasy, which is good. It was good to see Thor showing off his powers because he really doesn't get to do that a whole lot until later on in the film. I never liked the Destroyer though, and to me it always felt like the second to last boss of the video game, where once you beat it, it unlocks the final boss. Loki was the villain of this film, and I just don't get the need for the Destroyer here. I don't know how Brana could have done it any differently or any other way, but regardless, it just never worked for me. And that's the thing. I can talk ad nauseum about Iron Man 2's villains or Hulk CGI, but this film, Thor, doesn't have a glaring weakness. It has a lot of little things that, for me personally, just don't sit well. Whether it be Thor's character, the Earth scenes, the humor, some of the action, it just, for whatever reason, doesn't work for me. I always thought Loki was a rather weak character in the first Thor film, but after seeing it again, I realized just how untrue that is. He has a clear, strong motivation, and his actions all make sense, which is the first time I can say that about an MCU villain in this rewatch series. If you enjoy this film, I could totally see why, because there are a lot of subjective elements here that may work for other people. The character of Thor doesn't appeal to me in this film because he just feels like a lifeless Shakespearean caricature, and I found myself only wanting to see scenes with Loki. While this was an interesting first step to take with Thor, it's not one that hit home for me. I'll give Thor a C+ and a 7 out of 10. We're getting closer to the Avengers, but before we do, the next film in the MCU rewatch is Captain America: The First Avenger. So comment down below and let me know what you thought about Thor. Make sure to subscribe and give this video a like, and be sure to check out these videos that are on the screen right now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.